This is part 2 of chapters 11, 12, and 13. Now we left off looking at Alexander Calder's mobiles and the assemblage process. Now in case you don't know what a mobile is, think of a baby's crib, and it's the little thing that hangs over generally that spins and plays music, helps them go to sleep. That's a good example of a mobile, and Alexander Calder's the best known for that in sculpture. Now, the most of the sculpture we have looked at is what we consider to be in the round. And that means that it is freestanding and complete on all sides, even on the top. Now, relief sculpture is meant to be viewed from one side only. So it's flat, usually presents itself on a wall coming out from the wall. It has some three-dimensional depth when it comes out from the wall, but does not occupy space in the round because it is that flat on one side. Now there are two types of relief. There is low and high. Low relief is also called bas relief, or BAS. A good example of this would be that image on a coin. Your text has an example on page 241, figure 11.2. Now, high relief or haute relief is more like what you would think of as flat and then has dimensional depth coming out. So I think of maybe what a good example would be a taxidermied deer head. It's flat on one side and then projecting out. So page 242, figure 11.3 is a good example of a haute relief. Now here, in case you couldn't envision, that coin, that bas relief, and then here is the example of a haute relief where it's coming out, projecting from that wall that's still flat on one side. Now the human figure in sculpture has been a popular subject matter that cuts across time and cultures and can be specific to a region and time in history. I put up here this example of Egyptian because I always found it interesting, the correlation between that flat, no depth drawings that we see Egyptians do and then their beautiful sculptures in the round. Very interesting that they do not kind of meld together. Now in sculpture, especially in human figures, sometimes things we see are repeated over and over again. And this particular sculpture of Venus de Milo, it's great. I don't know that we would know Venus de Milo if she had arms, so this is really a famous sculpture. But the way in which she is standing there with that curved body is what we call contrapposto. This is meaning a counterpose or counterbalance that sets the body in a gentle S-shaped curve through the play of opposites. So this is something that we find that is very traditional in sculpture, that contrapposto pose. Now here is another famous sculpture of Poseidon, and the only thing missing there is his Triton. Here is a really great example of the clay army. There is a great link there of the clay army. I would suggest that you guys, highly suggest that you go and watch it. It's interesting to know that every single one of them was different. And when you think about how many were made in that time period, they kind of figured that there was possibly maybe a dozen people working on each one of those at a time. So very interesting. Make sure you watch that. Now, environmental sculpture can refer to sculptures that are large enough for viewers to enter and move around in. They create their own environment. It can be large sculptures made for the outdoors, or can actually be a part of the environment. So Mount Rushmore is a really good example of an environmental sculpture. That is a part of the environment. Now this is one that's being man-made in Cancun, and Cancun is a very popular destination for tourists, and many people who go there end up scuba diving in the ocean, and the coral reefs are kind of being destroyed because of the overpopulation of people being there. So Cancun has come up with these underwater sculpture galleries. So there's a great video link there for you to watch that talks about this great underwater gallery. Now this is another great example of sculpture, and with a material that maybe you didn't think of sculpture as coming in a material as paper. Now this particular artist is Matthew Schlann, and there's a great video link there talking about him and his ideas and his construction and his process. So I really suggest you take a look at that also. Now, kinetic sculpture are sculptures that incorporate motion as a part of the artistic expression. So the mobiles of Alexander Calder that we talked about, these are really great examples because they spin, they move. Sometimes it's because we start them to move, and sometimes it can be wind, all of those kinds of things. So I would highly suggest that you take a look at the video there. That is a link to kinetic sculpture. Now, this is a great example of kinetic sculpture that is done by an artist who started out in painting. And artists generally get bored. So he was bored with his static world and then moved into creating these beautiful sculptures. And if they look kind of familiar to you, it's because this artist actually made the sculpture that was for the Olympic cauldron that we saw in Brazil. So take a look at that. That one's really fun and interesting. Now, light sculptures are also designed to make light inhabit space so that it feels materially present. So I myself am one of those people that I probably hadn't ever seen this. You guys might have seen this if you've gone to concerts and things like that. But being a mom of 3 kids and going to Disney World, that's where I actually know this from. So that's what the video link is down there. You will see how Disney has thrown up basically kind of fog or smoke into the air, and then they will project the animation onto the smoke to where that the light inhabits space. So very interesting. Snow and sand, ice, those are all kinds of things that also go into the snow and sand go into another area and material of sculpture that possibly you wouldn't think of as your normal sculpture, but yet you guys have probably all done a snowman in the yard or a sand castle on the beach. I do have down there note that in that video link there, kind of fast forward 2 minutes into the video to kind of see what I'm actually talking about, so you don't have to watch the whole thing, you just kind of get the idea. Now, crafts is the next section, and the word craft is derived from referring to expert work that is done by hand. So this can be found on page 265 in your text. Now, when we talk about craft, what separates the craft object from the art object? Well, that is basically the materials that are used. Traditional materials for crafts are clay, glass, metal, wood, and fiber. So any of those materials that are used, that can qualify for it to be a craft instead of an art. Okay, now clay, which we usually see pottery or ceramicists using, that are objects that are fired or baked clay. Once it has been molded and let to dry, it becomes very fragile. And then it is put into a kiln at temperatures ranging from somewhere between 1200 to 2700 degrees. And once the object is fired, it is then quite durable and resistant to the elements. So that's when we actually can use plates, bowls, those kinds of things. Now, basic ceramics have been dated back to about 5000 BC. So we've had this as an art for a very long time. But remember, because of that material, it's considered a craft. So there are ceramic methods listed here as pinching, slab, coiling, and throwing. So pinching is the first method that we believe was used. It's basically taking a lump of clay between your fingers and basically pinching and molding it into a shape. I'm sure if you've played with Play-Doh, you've done this particular technique. Now, slab is where you take the clay and roll it out into sheets, much like pie dough. And here you would see the example of taking and cutting it into these rectangular shapes, and then they're somewhat making a box. One of the things that you don't see here is that it's not as simple as just taking it and plunking it on top of there. That ceramic artist has actually gone in and scored the sides that are going to be touching, and then they will use what is called slip, which is kind of a liquid clay that they'll paint on in between, and that will help those stick together. Now, coiling is basically the rolling out of the clay into long rope-like strands, then coiling them on top of each other. You see here, you've probably done that again with your Play-Doh, rolling it out and building from there. Now on page 266, figure 12.1, you'll see an example of a coiled pot. Now that coiled pot doesn't even look coiled on the outside. It just looks coiled from the inside. Generally, artists sometimes will smooth out the outside, but sometimes leave evidence of the coiling from the inside. Now, throwing clay is centered on a potter's wheel, and that clay ball centered on a potter's wheel. Then, as it is spinning, the ceramicist will use their hands to basically push their thumbs in and lift the form with their fingers up. So, what we're going to do is, here you see there's that potter's wheel. It's going to be spinning, and the clay then is centered. The centering part is the hardest part. So if any of you out there have ever experienced this, you probably know what I'm talking about. The movie Titanic, the little old lady's doing the potter's wheel, or on the movie Ghost, Demi Moore and Patrick Swayze are basically having a makeout section with the potter's wheel. But there you can see an example of this being done. Now, if you follow this video link, I highly suggest, these are masters ceramic artists and showing different techniques and how some of this is made, and it is just amazing video link. So make sure you're watching that one too. Now, clay differs in their composition, but are usually categorized by firing temperature. So there are 3 different types here. We have earthenware, stoneware, and porcelains. Now, earthenware generally comes in the red-brown colors and fires at the lowest temperature. So this is more like that terracotta pot you have outside. It's very brittle, so when the temperature changes, moisture changes, it can crack and kind of fall apart. That's that lowest temperature. Stoneware is actually fired at a medium temperature and are generally brown and gray, and a lot of our commercial dinnerware is made out of this. So it stands up a little bit heavier, it's a little bit stronger. So our everyday dishes are going to be that stoneware. Now, porcelains are fired at the highest temperature, so this would be our fine dinnerware, china, vases, figurines, those kinds of things. So a lot stronger of a piece there. Now, what we see on the outside of clay, ceramics, and pottery usually looks like some sort of glassy color has been painted on. And that's usually what we call a glaze. That is that glass-like material usually applied to the surface of the ceramic piece and then fired on so that it fuses the glaze with the clay. Now, one of the earliest glazes comes from about 3000 BC, and it's called Egyptian paste. That's what this turquoise Egyptian piece looks like. So where it's turquoise, and it actually comes in a powder form, it's not painted on. So it's actually when the clay is mixed, that is actually kind of mixed in with the clay. Now, we're going to pick up on part 3 with glass in the crafts area.